All right, let's get started. And welcome to another Overby Center program. We are delighted to have our friend Peter Boyer with us today. And Peter is a Mississippian from Gulfport. He went to Ole Miss, but then he wandered off to UCLA where he got his degree. He's interested in all sorts of things from film, TV. He was even a television media critic at one time for the New York Times. He's had a varied career, everything from PBS Frontline to Fox News. For that, I'll forgive him. And from the New Yorker to Newsweek, so a little bit of everything. But right now, he's the national correspondent for the Weekly Standard, and we're just real glad to have him here to get his insight on our elections, which are upcoming, which just leads me right into my first question, Peter, is, is there anything that makes these particular elections more significant than the usual off-year elections?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I say that because you and I are journalists, and it is our perhaps even constitutional, if not religious, duty to say that every election is the most important election that ever happened in the history
I've been there, done that.
of democracy. This one really is important because we have the reasons all of y'all know. We have a president like none we've had. We have a polarized, politicized electorate like none we've had in my lifetime anyway, at least my cognizant lifetime. And, the last campaign never ended. So this is another take in a way. It's in some ways. Steve Bannon said to me not 2 months ago, we were talking about this election, and Bannon had hoped to lead a nationalist populist surge in this 2018 election. And he had compiled a list of, shall I move this down a little bit perhaps? He had compiled a list of candidates around the country that he was going to support, and he thought that that was going to be, that was going to be this great breakthrough. That hasn't exactly materialized for reasons having to do with Bannon's own toxicity. But he said something which I think is true. He said, Donald Trump absolutely is on the ballot in every election, certainly every congressional election, and he should be. People who want to vote against him because they don't like his yellow hair and his orange complexion and his, his fixation with social media, so be it. But there are people who will, one thing you have to say is this president has a record of governance. And that is very much on the ballot too. So he is, I think, taken this country in a starkly different direction in the last almost 2 years now. And so, yeah, it's important. If Democrats take the House, or if Democrats win, we have a whole different next 2 years and beyond. If not, we'll see.
Do the Democrats take the House? What's your guess?
My answer to that is they sure ought to take the House. I mean, they sure enough ought to take the House for every reason, reasons having to do with districting and just every reason, Trump, all the other stuff. I look at it a different way. I think the Republicans' chances, this is sort of an ass backwards way of putting it, but I think it's true. I think the Republicans' chances of holding the House and the Senate are better than the Democrats' chances of taking the Senate. In other words, I think that Republicans' chances of holding the House are better than the Democrats' chances of taking the Senate.
Explain the situation in the Senate.
What I think will happen now, right now Republicans have a one-seat advantage. I think they will pick up They stand to pick up as many as 5. I think it'll be 3. I think that if that happens, the Kavanaugh stuff we just went through wouldn't have occurred because you're not trying to influence these, these critical 1 or 2 senators. If the Republicans have a 53, 54, which is possible, seats in the Senate, Trump's, no matter what happens in the House, Trump's program goes full speed ahead. Well, not quite full speed, but pretty full speed ahead over the next 2 years. The speed bump will be, if the Democrats take the House, all of the investigations that they will immediately launch.
Well, part of the situation in the Senate, of course, is the Democrats are defending 25 of the seats.
Yes.
And so the Republicans have more to gain.
And the Democrats are defending a lot of seats. Some of the Democrat seats, are easy. Some of the seats that they're defending are seats that Republicans probably should have held anyway. And a couple of the takeaways for Democrats, you and I have talked about this a little bit. Takeaways in the sense that people in our business have been excitedly talking about it. The Democrats can win this one. Let me just go on a slight.
You want to talk about Beto or yet?
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
Okay, it's a good segue. Everybody knows the situation in Texas, the Senate race.
Beto O'Rourke. Texas is a place that's just Republican. It's just independent and conservative and Texas. And every so often, there will be the great blue hope for Texas, for Senate, for governor, for whatever. And people in our business who are uniformly Democrats, almost uniformly liberals, get real excited about it. And news directors at television networks and the editors, national editors at newspapers and magazines send reporters down to rhapsodize about the latest great blue hope in Texas. And everybody gets very excited. And, Texas always ends up being Texas. And the great blue Democrat always ends up losing. I did a story, you may not remember, a guy named Ron Kirk was running for Senate against the white-headed guy who's the senior Texas Cornyn. And I went down there, Texas is going to elect a Democrat, the first Democrat since Lloyd Bentsen. Texas is going to vote against Beto. But the thing that's interesting about the Beto O'Rourke phenomenon to me is the Atlantic Monthly did a story, very respected mainstream center-left magazine, did a huge profile of Beto O'Rourke, who is such the darling of the left because it's always the next Kennedy. And they said, even if he loses in Texas, he should become the Democrats' next presidential nominee. And that's sort of, how Democrats, in my view, tend to see things. They cast their candidates.
So the winner in Texas is, as you say, the incumbent. Tell us, you had interesting comments about Ted Cruz in our class yesterday.
If you could, if you were looking for a vulnerable red state incumbent, you would do what Marco Rubio did, and you would point to Ted Cruz. Marco Rubio looked at, was asked about Ted Cruz, and he said, well, that may be the first assassination ever to occur on the Senate floor, is how hated Ted Cruz, especially in his first 2 years, was, even by his Republican colleagues in the Senate. He's not a charmer. He's a guy who just as smart as a whip, but he's kind of pasty and has this kind of weird voice, and he doesn't have a sense of timing and shut down the government and yet he's going to win by 10 points in Texas. So,
but let's talk about Mississippi. You've already been down here. You've written about our 2 Senate races. You concentrated on our special Senate race with McDaniels and Espy and Cindy Hyde Smith. What's your take on these 2?
I think y'all have had a few months to accustom yourselves to the phrase Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith, which is good because that's what you'll be saying from now for the rest of my life, certainly. And that's what I think is going to happen. I think Mitch is an interesting guy who's kind of out of his time. You know, Mississippi Senate races are just wonderfully interesting to me. When I was growing up here, you too, Curtis, there used to be two senators, and they were going to be senators forever and ever, amen. And one of them was Big Jim Eastland, and from Sunflower, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. And one of them was a nice man, notwithstanding the fact that he went to Mississippi State, John Stennis. And they were just going to be senators forever. And then we started electing, then Mississippi always was conservative, but then the party affiliation thing changed. And we started electing these sort of sunny, smiley, Sunbelt kind of Republicans who were very establishment guys. I mean, they all had really good hair. They looked kind of like weathermen, Trent, and some of them were fraternity brothers of mine, so I don't mean to criticize them.
Both former cheerleaders at Ole Miss.
Yeah, and you know, there was a certain sort of aspect to them. They weren't fire-breathing guys. Like people would think a conservative from Mississippi in the Senate would be some stentorian guy, you know, railing against school busing or something. But these were very smiley kind of guys who got the system. They knew seniority worked. They knew how both chambers of Congress worked, and they worked their way up, and Trent became a leader. And Mitch isn't that guy. Mitch is, I mean, one of the people, he loves Trump. One of the people he admires is Ted Cruz. And, you know, he wants to get into the Senate and turn the tables over. I think that a lot of things go against him, apart from Cindy Hyde-Smith's incumbency, which is huge. This isn't that moment. I mean, those Republicans, those conservatives who were sore at the establishment in Washington are much less sore right now. Now they're sore at the people who dress up in handmaiden suits and, you know, holler at people when they're getting into elevators and scream with their signs. And they believe that the establishment in Washington, I'm speaking of conservatives now, they believe that the establishment in Washington has handled that pretty well. They got Brett Kavanaugh through. They've gotten an untold number of other judicial appointments through. And I don't think there is the anti-establishment feeling on the right that there is on the left. So that was a long-winded answer to your question. I think SB will probably win not win, but come in first. There will be the runoff. Cindy will win, and there is the long shot you talk about, which is SB McDaniel, and then in the actual run, the runoff.
Yeah, that's predicated on the precedent in Alabama, where you wound up with the crazy guy running against as the Republican against Doug Jones, and people recoil from the idea of voting for this Tea Party wingnut.
McDaniel would certainly be, in his defense, I think he'd be painted as being Roy Moore, but he's not. I mean, he's a smart guy, a state senator who, he certainly is seen as extreme by Democrats, but he would be out of the course of the sort of Republican that Mississippi usually sends to Washington. But I don't know. I think he would beat SB, but I don't think he's going to get the chance.
Yeah, no, he's certainly more legitimate than Judge Roy Moore, and did have a substantial following here 4 years ago when he nearly beat Thad Cochran. You mentioned Cavanaugh. What's going to be the fallout from that nationwide? Do you see it having much impact on particularly the Senate races?
I do, Curtis. Things change so lickety-split quick these days. I don't know if what I'm fixing to say will hold even till halftime tomorrow, but I kind of think it will. It is the case that half, I would argue slightly more than half of the country that still considers itself in the center or the center right has felt very ambivalent about this president. And there's a core who just love Trump and want all Trump all the time. And then there are people on the right who love some things about Trump, the fact that he takes the fight to the other side and he doesn't give up, and they like the way his governance, in fact, has been more conservative than anybody since Reagan, and you can make an argument that it's been more effective in its first 2 years than Reagan's. But pretty much everybody on the right, and certainly everybody on the other side, just can't get their eyes off of or their minds off of just the antic nature of this presidency. It's just weird every day. It's just every day there's some new weirdness. And so, because of that, I think that there were a lot of Republicans who were saying, okay, what the news media is telling me is true. History said, blah, 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 midterms, blah, 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 Democrats. And then Kavanaugh happened, and it was so over the top, the Democratic opposition to it, with complete, wholehearted, enthusiastic complicity by people in our business. It was just so over the top, partly because all they needed to do was turn a couple of votes to defeat him, that it just fired up, not just Republicans, but I think a lot of independents who are just kind of repulsed, who are even more repulsed by screamers in the face than they are by reckless tweets. And they've had a long time to accustom themselves to the peculiarities of this president, but the handmaiden in your face stuff was chasing Ted Cruz out of restaurants, and all of that is just, forgive my use of this term, but normal Americans on either side are kind of repulsed by that. And I think that will has enthused enough people, certainly in red states, Tennessee, I think even in Nevada, possibly Florida, elsewhere. I think Republicans and independents will show up and vote for Republicans in a way that they might not have a month ago.
And Republicans are using some of the scenes at the Capitol as portraying it as a lynch mob, portraying the Democrats.
It's weird, Curtis, how our friends on the left, in your case they're really friends, in my case I just am saying that. No, actually, most of my colleagues and friends actually are liberals, but the reluctance to call what is on its face mob-like behavior a mob. I mean, the idea that mob has suddenly become the M word, as they say on MSNBC. I mean, in the same way that we, I think, should be offended by some of Donald Trump's behavior just for reasons of decorum and propriety and norms, I think it's just rude when a man is with his wife at supper, or a woman like is with her family at a movie on a weekend. What Maxine Waters and others have suggested, get in their face all the time. I read one yesterday. If you work in a restaurant and you serve a Republican, put your fingers in the salad. I mean, that's not good. And it strikes. I say that it's not. I don't think even a value judgment. I think it's just most Americans are decent, and most Americans think that that's not good. And it may. I think it's had an effect, and it will bear out in this election.
Let's go back to the I word, impeachment. It's something the Democrats right now are not talking about publicly. They're not making it a campaign issue, but it's lurking there, and they win control of the House.
Yeah.
So they're in a position they can initiate impeachment proceedings, but that's essentially the equivalent of a grand jury. Been plenty of people indicted never convicted. It goes to the Senate. Why bother with impeachment proceedings if you don't have the votes in the Senate to carry through?
There is, and y'all remember you heard it here first. I don't care if the Democrats, well, if they won all the seats, of course it would be different. If the Democrats take the House, there is not a chance in hell that they are going to impeach Donald Trump or Brett Kavanaugh. Why? For the same reason that they're now not talking about it. I mean, these people may act stupid sometimes, but they ain't stupid. And there's another the next election cycle, which also includes the presidency, starts in 2 nanoseconds after the results are declared in this one. As much as the activist base of the Democratic Party wants impeachment left and right, it would be the fight would become about that. Now, you have the wild card of the Mueller report, the independent counsel. It is possible, although, again, I think it's extremely unlikely that he's going to come back and say, yes, Donald Trump stole this election, in which case I'd vote for his impeachment. But he will almost certainly frame it in whatever he comes out with, I think he will frame it in a way that both sides can seize upon and say, see, there was no collusion, or see, look how crooked this guy was. That may excite some of the activists left, but whoever becomes the next speaker, if it's a Democrat, the last thing he or she is going to want to do is take up impeachment. They will talk about it a little bit, as much as they can get away with. They will, whip their membership and then they'll say, sorry, we just don't have enough to, I just think it's a political loser for Democrats, and.
So you don't think they go there?
No. I mean, Curtis, there's a reason they don't want to talk about it now. They know that it's not a winner for them.
Let's talk about the House. If the Democrats take over, does Nancy Pelosi continue in her leadership position, or are they going to try to replace her? Pelosi, very effective and popular in a lot of places, but not in the South. The Republicans brand any Democratic candidate as being an acolyte of Nancy Pelosi. They even in their ads put a sinister Italian mafia pronunciation on Pelosi's name. I mean, she's.
Is that so? I haven't seen.
Oh, they poor Travis Childers in this district, who was a Democrat, briefly held the seat, and they made him sound like a consigliere to the mafia because of Pelosi. The Democrats try to overthrow her and replace her with, say, a Steny Howard?
That's a good question. I think she was a very, very able leader. I think she's a very able speaker. I disagree with about 99% of her stuff, but she's a capable person. But for the reasons you said, I mean, except for the mafiosi part, which I hadn't known. I'm glad to know it now, though. Democrats, not just in the South, are running away from Nancy. I think there is something to be said for, can't we have some leader on the Democratic side who is under 75? There are a lot of smart young Democrats who, so my guess is if I were betting, I think she'll put up a good fight, but I think she will not be the speaker if the Democrats win.
Okay. Let's touch on 2 or 3 other races, and then I want to turn it over to questions from the audience. But those of us who live in North Mississippi are subjected to constant commercials out of the Tennessee Senate race from Memphis television. What's going on there, and does Phil Bredesen, the Democrat, have a chance of beating Marsha Blackburn?
Well, no. there's a new poll today that shows him up a point, but it's nonsense. The thing is, Bredesen's one of those guys who benefits from two things. One, he governed as a normal human being when he was the governor of Tennessee, so therefore he becomes that rarest of things, a Democrat who can govern and who isn't identified immediately by ideology. Let's put it that way. And a lot of independents and Republicans might, not set themselves afire at the thought of having him in the Senate. But it's Senate, not governor, he's running for, number one. So everybody in Tennessee knows that if he goes to Washington, he's going to be answering to Chuck Schumer, period. But beyond that...
so they tag him with Schumer the same way they tag congressional candidates with Pelosi.
And in the same way, every Democrat tagged every House Republican in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich, and now with Donald Trump, and that's politics. But beyond that, I think Marsha's a good, strong, she knows Washington. She's a good, strong figure. But I think Tennessee was fired up more than a lot of places by this fight over Kavanaugh, and I would not be surprised to see her win by 8 or more.
Well, Bredesen said he would have voted for Cavanaugh.
Yeah, right. We believe that. Again, if I were a Democrat from the South, I am a Democrat, but if I were a Democrat political person from the South, I'd ask myself, why is it that all of our candidates from half of America have to kind of fib about what they stand for in order to have a chance of getting elected? And then what I might do is actually try to adopt some of the positions that might be actually more moderate. What I might do is, in fact, follow the course of William Jefferson Bloody Clinton and win the White House back-to-back instead of going off the left side of the world, which is what the party has done, which is precisely why people like Bredesen have a difficult time. I mean, in Washington, apart from this bitter partisanship and party fealty that people these days are expected to follow, Bredesen wouldn't be that different and isn't that different ideologically from Lamar. He really wouldn't be. And but he doesn't get to run as that, and because people wouldn't believe him. I don't believe that he would have voted for Kavanaugh, and neither do you.
Yeah. Florida's Bill Nelson and the outgoing Republican governor, Rick Scott.
I think Scott's going to win that.
You think all Republicans are going to win, or maybe we should get out of the southern
I think there are
races?
Republicans who in fact could lose. I think it's a long shot, as I was about to say, before you jumped down my throat for what I thought was going to be a very smart point. I think his incumbency actually might hurt the astronaut from the left. He's just been there forever. Remember Alan Cranston? He's acquired that kind of, forgive me, cadaver kind of aspect of a guy who, he seems like a guy who's...
Now, you're being very unkind.
He seems like, well, I was unkind to you didn't object when I called Ted Cruz pasty, but he seems like a guy who's been there forever. And Rick Scott was seen as a relatively successful governor. The governor's race there is so kind of weird. The congressional race that Donna Shalala's in is weird too. I mean, so Florida's kind of hard to get a fix on. But the reason if we were at the racetrack and these were horses, I would put a little bit of long shot. I'd expect to get 5-2 odds, and I would bet on Scott.
Okay. Couple of interesting breakthroughs in primaries earlier with emerging, surprising winners in places like Massachusetts and New York. Those races with either blacks or Hispanics. In the South, you've got, aside from Mike Espy here, you've got some other credible black candidates for the first time running statewide. Georgia, what's your take on the race there between Stacey Adams, a black woman, running against Lieutenant Governor Brian Kemp?
That's a fun race.
Supposed to be a dead heat.
Yeah, and it's sort of hard to, again, part of that has to do with just, if you know what I mean, the machinery of politics, what precinct they're able to turn out in parts of Atlanta and other metropolitan areas. I think it's interesting and important for our country that more and more minorities and women put themselves up for office and win. I would point out that I think it's even more important that that minority people, that folks from all ethnicities and orientations and gender do so, that their physical diversity be matched by their ideological diversity. I mean, I think it's important to have an African American as a United States Senator from South Carolina. Somehow our business didn't quite celebrate Tim Scott's election in the way I have the feeling we would if the Georgia race turned out in her favor. But I think that's important. I mean, and here's why it's important. If you can think of Tim Scott as a Republican senator from South Carolina, you're not thinking of him as, oh, the black guy from South Carolina. And my own view is that I'm not a big identity politics guy, and I just think it's corrosive and not helpful. And so on the one hand, I think that I would encourage, and I hope that it happens. On the other hand, for the reasons I just said. So what do I think is going to happen in Georgia? That's a toss of the coin to me.
Okay. We're neglecting our other Senate race in Mississippi, so we need to give equal time to Roger Wicker and David Barrier. At least in this race, Democrats in Mississippi in recent years have been notorious in running fairly obscure and not particularly well qualified candidates in these major races. And this time, Democrats do have very legitimate candidates, with David Barrier running against Wicker and Mike Espy in the special race. But everybody seems to be kissing off the Wicker race. You figure Wicker cruises to re-election?
Did I think that Ole Miss was not going to beat Alabama this year?
No. Okay.
I'm afraid I did not think that they would. I think it's part of the reason why it seems so obvious. But the reason Democrats don't elect folks from places like Mississippi is because if a place like Mississippi sends a Democrat to Washington, the way things currently are, they're not allowed to represent Mississippi. They end up representing the National Democratic Party. They end up voting for the National Democratic Party, which means they're constantly, on the griddle. They're constantly, poor Joe Manchin. I mean, maybe he's masochistic, maybe he enjoys it, but every vote is constant. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? He can't leave his office without, the press. Is he going to go this? And again, going back to the Clinton time, Clinton and Gore took southern states, and I'm not saying that Democrats should become conservative. I'm just saying it would be, I think, a lovely thing if both sides sort of broadened the tent a bit.
Okay.
And would make it easier for candidates from places like Mississippi.
Yeah. Questions from the audience. We've got a few minutes left. Come on, need some questions. Back there, yes, sir.
Do you believe that senators should have a term limit?
No, I believe senators should be elected by state legislatures, like they used to be.
Good Lord.
I just said that to see if I could actually
Yeah.
cause, I mean,
Yeah.
I almost caused Curtis to keel over dead when I told him in the Grove that I joined Fox News, and I figured, no, I don't believe in term limits. I believe in what they set out to accomplish, which is I can't stand the idea of a permanent governing class. I hate it. Just, ugh. It's not good, and it's not what our founders intended. But on the other hand, we have a representative democracy, and if folks want to keep sending the same folks back forever, and in the case of the South, there has been, because of the rules of the House and Senate, there has been advantage to be gained from sending the same folks over and over again. So when I think it's up to the folks, and if the folks keep sending them back, as much as I'd like to see people go home after 2 terms in the Senate, I don't think there should be or will be.
Okay. Questions, please. Anybody to? Yes.
Yes.
I was just wondering if y'all could elaborate a little bit more on how you think elections in the future will go now that Brett Kavanaugh has been, I guess, officially appointed, because he is a conservative judge, but this is like the first time in 30 years that he has been a more conservative judge, because he reflects the kind of like the swing vote in the Supreme Court. So how do you think that will like affect our country?
You mean in terms of how the Supreme Court will likely rule? I mean,
Yeah, like, I guess just like go into a little more depth of how you think that will change how voters will vote in the future, since there's been like that 30-year push to get like that swing vote either like right wing or more conservative.
yes, that's a good question. I think it's a thoughtful question, and it's way more thoughtful than most of the national discussion over Kavanaugh and most of the press stuff about his appointment has been. I think those conservatives who are thinking that his presence on the court is going to turn it into a dead certain vote against Roe v. Wade or any of that are just going to be disappointed. I don't think he's going to be that kind of justice. I think he's going to be smarter and more steadfast in his fealty to constitutional principles and his view of constitutional principles than the justice he replaces and the man for whom he clerked. So I don't think he's going to necessarily be the guy that the New York Times is writing editorials glowingly about the day before, a decision in the hope that they can bring him over to their side. I don't think he's going to be that justice. I also don't think he's going to be, let's put it this way. I think the Supreme Court is going to end up with its present now configuration. It's going to end up being much less important to our daily lives than it was cast as being during the Kavanaugh hearing. I think that, other folks, depends what happens in this election, but other folks on that bench, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, I think she has a book in the Old Testament named after her, or was it a different Ruth? But she's been around for a while, and there's always the possibility that, she will retire, and others, which will give us more of the same kinds of fights if Trump is president and if the Republicans hold the Senate. But that really might change. Of course, the court's going to be fed a lot of cases that, with Kennedy there, they might not have been fed, having to do with Roe v. Wade and narrowing abortion rights and all of that stuff. But he's a solid constitutionalist, and he's not a radical. And he has deep regard for, I think, the institution and for settled law. And I think it's going to be much less important than it was made out to be during the fight over him.
Yeah, I'm going to say that I think, and this was before Kavanaugh, I think that increasingly we are determining who we might vote for president on what he might do with the court. I know of a number of friends of mine who voted for Trump, and they said they didn't particularly care for Trump, but they liked the idea of what Trump might do to preserve a more conservative majority on the court. I remember the night Trump was elected, I said to myself, my God, there goes the Supreme Court for the rest of my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I think, especially post Cavanaugh, we're going to tend to, consider, the Supreme Court when we think about who we're going to vote for president and what he may do to the court. Yeah. I think that, 10 years ago, I don't think that was a consideration when people sat down to vote for president. I think it may become a major factor in presidential politics.
I agree. The political side, it absolutely will. I don't see a scenario where it can stop. I mean, in the immediate future, because it's 5-4. Democrats, perhaps you've noticed, tend not to appoint justices who ever do anything except stay in the liberal bloc in their voting. And I think Kavanaugh is a more solid vote in that regard. But there's going to be another appointment, and I think that absolutely affects how people vote and the politics around it. It's funny. You said what on election night? Oh my God, there goes the Supreme Court.
I did. It's the first thing I thought of.
That's funny. I said, oh, thank God, the Supreme Court saved.
There you go. Got time for one more question. In the middle. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the issue of intellectual diversity in the media and how a lot of reporters on the liberal side.
Yes.
And I know there have been a couple of studies recently that show that Americans sort of see media outlets as things to be biased, like the New York Times being liberal and Fox News tends to be conservative. Do you think that there are grounds for hiring a more intellectually diverse?
Oh my Lord. Oh. Absolutely. I mean, if I don't believe in dictatorships, but if I could be dictator for one day, I would insist that there be diversity in 2 institutions, forgive me. One being the academy, where there is about as much intellectual diversity as in the media, in fact, maybe even less, just for the good of everybody. I mean, if Curtis didn't have folks from time to time to sharpen his wit with whom he disagrees, he'd just be a doddering, crazy, old, cranky left-winger instead of the charming, bright.
I don't deny
it. and I genuinely mean that. I mean, I think schools owe it to children not to be indoctrinated on either side, but to not be force-fed a way of thinking. And I think that's, every newsroom I have ever been in my life, and shall recite them for you now. I have worked at the AP, the LA Times, the New York Times, CBS News, the New Yorker Magazine, Newsweek, Frontline at PBS. Every place I've worked has been liberal mainstream media. And without exception, the newsroom thought the same way in every place. So even without getting up in the morning and saying, here's how we're going to tilt this story, they perceive the world in a particular way. And on television, we'll hire a couple of conservatives to do this. But if you have a diverse academy, if you have a diverse news media, it helps everybody. It sharpens your focus. It takes people away from what I think so many journalists have fallen into, which is activism disguised as journalism. I don't consider Sean Hannity a journalist, for example. And I worked at Fox, and he's a nice guy and everything, but those guys aren't journalists. But the journalists at Fox were journalists, way more than the ones that I worked with at CBS News. And I love CBS News. But the reason I say that is Fox News was so aware of the fact that it's considered this faux news that the journalists play it pretty straight over there. CBS News has no one to challenge their thinking. So, yes, thank you for asking that question, because it's one that is on my mind a lot. And I think that in the era of Trump, as the mainstream press has blown out the norms of journalism, I think it has really hurt itself and hurt our profession in ways that may not be reparable.
Now, I would just say in closing, since I'll take this chance maybe to get in the last word, I think it's great when you have somebody like a David Brooks to New York Times. I think he's first-rate journalist. He was a reporter before he became a columnist, and the more people like that we have, I think, would be better. I would say, though, that I think journalism, I can't speak for academics, although I've been here all these years, but I think journalism, people who tend to be liberal are drawn toward the profession. If you look at the textbook definition of liberal, and it's one that I apply to myself, it's one who is tolerant of others, is interested in new ideas, is willing to accept change, is not wedded to the status quo. And you look up the definition of liberal.
Curtis is so sweet. I don't mean to interrupt. You're just such a sweetheart. I like your first definition, tolerant.
Yeah, I think that's that's the reason that I think so many people are. I think no question. Most journalists do tend to be liberal, but they're not activists. I think we're very conscious about not being activists and not inserting our opinion into our news stories. Otherwise, we'd lose our credibility. I say that to my students in class, that the most important thing we have as journalists is our credibility. And
amen to that.
And I think if you get on the soapbox for one side or another, you begin to undermine your own credibility.
I agree, and that's why I think
Peter and I have come to at least one point of agreement, and with that, I see people are defecting right and left because
you'll have
class is
classes
about
and
to
stuff
start.
to go.
And so anyway, thank you very much for coming, Peter. Thank you for being with us.
Are you kidding me? Thank you. Thank you all.